Do you remember that time when the Joker, Vision, Robert Baratheon, Gus Fring's business partner, and the robot from Rogue One teamed up to make a romantic comedy about jousting, and it ended up being one of the best movies ever made? What am I talking about? Of course you do.
It's called a lance. Hello?
A Knight's Tale is everything a movie should be. It's a drama about competition and honor and proving yourself. It's a medieval action movie with knights and sword fights and horses. It's a coming-of-age story about identity and self-discovery. It's a tale of friendship, of found families and fellowship. It's a romance, and of course, it's a comedy.
Would you care if I were ugly?
Well, yes. I mean, no.
But what's special about A Knight's Tale is the way in which it balances this humour with its real emotional and dramatic heart. A heart that is grounded in the simply outstanding chemistry between the main cast, and Heath Ledger's frankly insane levels of charm and charisma. A deep, genuine romance drives the story, as do the actions of a menacing and scheming villain, and it's all set in medieval Europe and backed up by a rock track with Queen, David Bowie, and AC/DC. Oh, and for some reason there's lots of fonging involved.
I will fong you!
And I will fong you.
I'm well aware a good fonging is on the way.
Fong him?
I'll fong you and hold up your arm! I'm about this fong you close, mate, I swear to God.
You can see why when I included a 3-second clip of A Knight's Tale in my last video, I got a deluge of comments not about the topic of that video, but about this one. People love it. And despite only performing moderately well at the box office, this mid-budget romantic comedy historical sports movie went on to firmly lodge itself in the pop culture conscience of an entire generation. So before we look at why people still love A Knight's Tale more than 2 decades after it came out, let's take a quick look at how it came to be made in the first place. Because on paper you wouldn't think that a romantic comedy historical sports movie would ever get approved by a studio, or that a studio would allow it to be directed by someone who only ever made one movie before, a movie that he was fired from. So maybe that's a good place to start. The writer and director of A Knight's Tale was Brian Helgeland, who was very much an up-and-coming screenwriter in Hollywood in the late 1990s. After writing a couple of low-budget horror flicks, Helgeland's big break as a screenwriter came in 1997, when he won the Oscar for Best Adapted Screenplay for LA Confidential, a crime thriller set in the 1950s that got nominated for 8 other Oscars. Funnily enough, he also won a Razzie Award for Worst Screenplay for The Postman, making him one of only 3 people to win an Oscar and a Razzie in the same year. But LA Confidential was good enough to get the attention of the right people, and in 1999 he got his first directing job on Payback, an action movie starring Mel Gibson that Helgeland also wrote. It wasn't a great directorial debut. He clashed with Gibson, who was also the movie's producer, and was effectively fired from the production. Helgeland's name still appears in the credits, but the final product is very much not his vision. He later released the director's cut, which is a much better movie. So that was the entire history of Brian Helgeland's filmmaking career up until he made A Knight's Tale in 2001. Some horror movies, a couple of police action thrillers, and one attempt at directing that saw him fired by the lead actor. So you might be wondering why the hell he chose to make a romantic comedy historical sports movie. Well, it was actually because of the issues he had making Payback.
When I was done with it, problems with the star and the studio and lots of things, I wanted to do something that took me back more to loving films in the first place.
Yeah. Now, if you're a writer or any sort of creative, you'll know that you have a list of potential ideas that is far longer than anything you'd ever end up finishing. I mean, Helgeland himself has said that he's written over 60 screenplays, only about 1/3 of which have ever been produced. He is clearly a writer who tries out a lot of different things and sees what works. And when it came to writing A Knight's Tale, he took one of those ideas and ran with it.
I wanted to do a jousting movie for 3 days, and then I put all the notes away, and I thought, that's the dumbest idea I ever had. When I was looking for something to do after Payback, I dragged all my old notes out, and I got to that one, and there was one line in there from the research I had done, which said you had to be noble to compete. And I thought to myself, well, that's it.
Once he had written a script, Helgeland shopped it around Hollywood and managed to sell it to Sony almost immediately. Now, this was partly because of Helgeland's writing profile and the quality of the script, but it was also because movie studios in the early 2000s were just much more willing to take chances on smaller projects. A Knight's Tale made a modest profit in theaters, but by no means a large one by Hollywood standards. To be fair, it was being released alongside Shrek, which was an absolute juggernaut, but not doing well in theaters was less of an issue for studios in the early 2000s because at that time, movies got 2 bites at the cherry, in theaters and on home video. It wasn't uncommon for movies to make half, if not more than half of their total revenue through home media sales. So even if they had a lukewarm run in cinemas, they could and did find a new life months or sometimes years later. Some of the most iconic and influential films of all time had bad receptions during their theatrical runs. But thanks to home video, they were gradually discovered and over time went on to become icons, as well as turning a profit for the studios. Today, movies like A Knight's Tale get one shot at doing well in theaters, and if they do poorly, they're quickly consigned to a streaming service where they'll slowly languish into obscurity until eventually they get deleted entirely so that the studio won't have to keep paying residuals to the artists who made them. Anyway, the state of modern Hollywood is the subject of another video, but yeah, word of mouth after its theatrical run spurred home media sales, and that's how A Knight's Tale went on to become so popular and so well known, despite at first only making a modest profit. Now, if you've clicked this video, I assume you already know the story of the film, but for those in the back not sitting on a cushion, it tells the story of William Thatcher, a squire pretending to be a knight so he can compete in jousting tournaments and win glory and riches.
Glory and riches, glory and riches!
He is aided in his quest by his friends, Roland,
Any minute now.
and of course, Wat.
Manky git! Hey!
Along the way, he meets Geoffrey Chaucer, a writer,
A what? A what? A writer?
and Kate the blacksmith.
Are you a woman or a blacksmith?
Sometimes I'm both.
He also meets the beautiful Jocelyn, who he falls in love with, and the evil Count Adhemar, who he does not fall in love with. Although, with the right editing, he does. Spoiler alert, Will is inevitably found out, but because he impressed the heir to the English throne in an earlier tournament, he is knighted and goes on to defeat Adhemar and get the girl. The story is a textbook hero's journey, but that's not a bad thing. Writing tropes and structures exist for a reason. They offer a framework from which you can hang a story. What matters is not whether a story is predictable, but whether the writer can get us to connect with the characters along the way. As you've probably gathered by now, that is very much what A Knight's Tale does. Production began in the year 2000. Helgeland was attached as director and given a budget of $65 million. A respectable sum, but by no means huge. For context of some other movies being made around the same time, Harry Potter's budget was about double that at $125 million, while The Fast and the Furious was just under half at $38 million. And speaking of Fast and the Furious, the only other actor seriously considered for the role of Will Thatcher was Paul Walker, but Helgeland felt that he wouldn't get the Englishness of the movie. So instead, he cast Australian actor Heath Ledger, who was still pretty unknown at this time. His breakout role in The Patriot hadn't yet been released to general audiences, but the executives were really pleased with what they were seeing, and so they were happy to bank on his talent enough to make him the lead in A Knight's Tale. Also, the fact that he looked like this probably had something to do with it. Ledger is very much the heart of this movie. It was a huge responsibility to lead a film like this at the age of just 21, but his boyish charm and relentless optimism just come through in every scene. Right from the start, when he flashes us this smile, we are 100% on his side. But he also built an earnest sincerity to the role, the same sincerity that drives William's ambition and passion. I mean, take this scene.
If I could ask God one thing, it would be to stop the moon. Stop the moon and make this night, your beauty, last forever.
Or this one.
He wanted you to know that he changed his stars after all.
Is the writing corny? Absolutely it is, but Ledger plays it so passionately and so sincerely that we cannot help but be caught up in it and get brought along for the journey with him. He brought something unique and genuine to every role he had in his sadly short career, and it all began here with William Thatcher, a character who, like the young kid from Western Australia, was determined to change his stars. But even more unknown than Heath Ledger was Shannon Soseman, who plays Jocelyn, the main love interest of the film and winner of the Spikiest Hair Award, which in 2001 was a tough competition. This was in fact Soseman's first ever film acting role. Before this, she was just DJing at celebrity parties in Hollywood.
Shannon was working as a DJ at the birthday party for Gwyneth Paltrow's brother, and casting director Francine Maisler talked to her and really liked her and asked her to come in and read for this movie.
She was cast after doing a screen test with Heath Ledger where their chemistry was immediately apparent. And I think she did a fantastic job in this movie. Jocelyn is a woman who feels trapped by the structures of the time she finds herself in, not being able to marry for love or have the independence she so clearly wants. Instead, she has to get the rules of jousting mansplained to her by Count Adhemar and then endure night after night promising to win the tournament in her name, each thinking they're being very romantic and original despite saying exactly the same thing. With the protagonist and love interest sorted, the filmmakers now had to find someone to play the villain. Rufus Sewell was ultimately cast, as we all know, but do you know who very nearly got the role? Trust me, if you watch this channel, you know his name.
The name's Bond. James Bond.
That's right, a few years before Bond, Daniel Craig auditioned for Count Adhemar. Now, we saw how well he can play a bad guy in Tintin, and apparently Helgeland was impressed, but he felt that the lead and the antagonist couldn't both have blonde hair, and so he went with Rufus Sewell to emphasize the contrast between hero and villain, which was the right call, and I'm sure Daniel Craig isn't losing too much sleep over that decision. Oh, and speaking of James Bond, the cast often joked that James Purefoy, who plays the Black Prince of Wales, would go on to be cast as 007, and yeah, I can see it. I mean, just look at the man. Also, speaking of James Bond, the stunt coordinator for a lot of the jousting scenes was none other than Paul Weston, who is a stuntman on 10 Bond films. Bond geeks like me will recognize him as this guy.
Yeah, hold on, you're dead!
Okay, I'll stop with the James Bond trivia for now because it's time to talk about
Geoffrey Chaucer's the name. Writing's the game.
Even though this was one of Paul Bettany's first film roles, Helgeland had written the role of Chaucer specifically with the actor in mind, but the studio executives weren't convinced that he could do comedy. I mean, they wanted to cast Hugh Grant. But Helgeland fought tooth and nail to keep Bettany, going as far as to threaten not to make the movie at all if they didn't cast him.
And because he'd had prior form of actually not making a movie, I guess they then said, fine, you can let him be in your picture.
I will be forever grateful to Brian Helgeland for this. Geoffrey Chaucer isn't just my favourite character in A Knight's Tale, he's one of my favourite characters in all of fiction. A character with incredible humour and charisma, wit and confidence, but also sensitivity and passion. A character who grew from someone giving into their weaknesses and only looking out for himself, to someone who came to genuinely care for and love his new family. Chaucer's also by far the most perceptive and emotionally intelligent member of the group. Every so often he gets this look in his eye when you can tell he's worked something out. He is always the one giving Will advice when he doesn't understand the social cue.
Don't you ever get tired of putting on clothes?
I believe she's talking about taking them off, my lord.
Or reining in others in the group.
Go and see to Ulrich. Go and see to Ulrich.
Or just generally knowing exactly what to say and how to say it.
Did she see me take the hit?
Yes, she saw you take the hit.
Or was she concerned?
It was dreadful. Her eyes welled up. It was awful.
Now, we all love his famous speeches, of course, where he rouses the crowd and hypes them up for William, or should I say,
Sir Ulrich von Liechtenstein!
But my favourite Chaucer moment is when Will is in the stocks. His friends come to defend him, armed with weapons or the tools of their trade, but Chaucer only has his words. But the crowd drowns him out, and you can just see in his eyes that if he could just get them to listen, they would come to understand. But his words cannot work if there is no one to hear them. And there is actually a deleted scene that shows us what Chaucer would have said in this moment, and Paul Bettany acts the hell out of it.
I ask you, what makes a man noble? His lineage or his heart? And what are knightly virtues? And who decides who may possess them? My lord, it's true, was born poor in Cheapside, London, and so what?
But this scene ends with the crowd on William's side, chanting his name and being totally convinced by Chaucer, which kind of leaves Prince Handsome with nothing to do when he shows up, so you can see why it was cut. Carrying on through the main cast, and we have Laura Fraser as Kate, who brings not just her skill as a blacksmith to the group, but also a beautiful level of wit and fun because she doesn't take any crap from the boys.
Oh, and you can do better, can you?
Of course I can.
And one of the things I love about Kate is the fact that the film never plays down her femininity in order for her to be accepted into the group. The film never feels the need to show her drinking them under the table or winning a fight in order to prove her value. She doesn't have to be one of the lads, she can just be Kate.
It's very romantic though.
Are you a woman or a blacksmith?
Sometimes I'm both.
Then King Baratheon himself, Mark Addy, was cast as Roland. And despite what Will might think, Roland is in fact the leader of the group. They all look to him for advice, calm and rationality, and his word is usually final.
Well, the Pope may be French, but Jesus is English. You're on.
And last but of course not least, who can forget Alan Tudyk as Wat?
What?
Wat is the clown of the group, and I just love how he's constantly right on the edge and has absolutely no filter or control over his rage.
Holy Mother, the Virgin Mary, are my witnesses! I will flog you!
There are so many little quirks and details of his performance that just make him a delight to watch, even if he's not saying anything. And he's also got one of the best moments in the film when he closes the loop of Will's hero's journey. In the first scene of the movie, Roland sees what Will is trying to do and he says,
I'm asking you, William Thatcher, to answer me with your name. It's not Sir William, it's not Count or Duke or Earl William.
And then in the final scene, Wat gets to say this.
That's your name, Will. Sir William Thatcher.
That's some good planting and payoff right there. These 5 actors are the absolute heart and soul of this movie, and I think the fact that they were all more or less unknown at this point was part of the reason for this. A Knight's Tale filmed almost entirely in the Czech Republic, and so the whole cast moved there for the entire shoot. With the exception of Addy and Sewell, they were all in their 20s at this time, and so they became fast friends in real life, enjoying Prague and getting to work together day after day on such a fun and exciting movie.
We had a joy making that movie. It's in the movie. And I think a lot of times when you're making a movie, how you make it becomes what the movie is. And if you have a kind of sincerity, it shows up in the movie, leads into the movie. And that movie had a joy to it all the way through that's on the screen, and I think people recognize it.
This is a true band of brothers, and the chemistry and bond that their characters forge in the story of the film was replicated in real life. A Knight's Tale is a story of friendship. More than the hero's journey of Will or the romance, it's a story that tells us that no one can go it alone. We need friends, we need a family. Each of these people brings something to the table to help Will change his stars. Well, I say everyone.
Maybe not you.
And take the scene where they are all helping Will write his letter to Jocelyn. It's one of the best scenes of the movie because it reveals how all of these characters are broken-hearted in one way or another. They've all lost something, but in this group, they have found trust and comfort. They show their deepest vulnerabilities to each other, and not once is there a joke or a cynical, sarcastic quip. It's real and sincere, and it moves us. These characters love each other, and they aren't afraid to say it.
God love you, William. So do I.
And this friendship is not just conveyed through the acting and the dialogue, it's baked into the filmmaking language. And take a shot like this one, where all of the fellowship are framed together. It's an efficient way to film the scene, sure, but it's also telling us that these people belong together. This is intentional. And it's not just this shot. There's the homage to The Right Stuff, of course, that's an obvious example, but throughout the film you almost never see any of this group framed by themselves except for Will. You almost always have a group of them together in the frame. And Brian Helgeland does a similar thing with the romance. He often frames Will and Jocelyn together so that we can see not just the actor who is speaking, but the reaction of the other. In the scene where they finally joust, the conversation leading up to it all takes place in a single shot that lasts over a minute, with the camera slowly pulling in closer and closer until finally their faces are the only thing in the frame. This right here, this is filmmaking language. You might not consciously notice it at first, but you still understand what it is saying. And Helgeland didn't limit this approach to the characters. He did it with the locations as well.
My camera operator, Mike Proudfoot, said to me one day, show the world and let the people decide what part of it they want to look at.
Over 12 weeks, real sets were constructed in the Czech Republic, which were filled with local extras to make up the crowds. One of the reasons the film has aged so well is because nothing you're looking at in scenes like this is fake. But besides Helgeland, the other person who deserves a mention is Alan Graff, the second unit director. Graff was responsible for shooting most of the crowd scenes and the jousting stunt work. Anything involving the main cast was Helgeland, but as soon as the visors went down, the second unit took over. Graff is a bit of an all-rounder, but most importantly for this film was his background as a professional American footballer and as a stunt coordinator on a whole host of sports movies. So he was the perfect person to trust with this project. Something that Helgeland really wanted to convey was how jousting was a sport just as popular as American football or proper football is today. And this is conveyed to us through the crowds. There's the chanting and the singing, there's the boozy beer bros, there's the guy selling food and drink. There's even shots like this one of the crowd trying to catch the ball, or the wave, or the face painting, and of course, the proper English football chants.
He's blonde! He's pissed! He'll see you
in the Liechtenstein! Liechtenstein!
All of these things are immediately recognizable to modern audiences, and so they help us understand what this sport means to the characters in the film. Who cares that the wave wasn't first seen until around the late 1970s? We know what this is, and it immediately puts us at ease. Which brings us to the music. Some boring people who don't know how to enjoy themselves criticize the music for not being historically accurate, and felt that modern pop songs being played over a medieval setting was anachronistic and jarring.
And someone came up to me and said, you know, they didn't have Queen in medieval times, and I felt quite foolish when I found that out. It was one of those stupid.
Like the sports comparisons, the music in A Knight's Tale is shorthand to help the viewers understand the feelings of the characters. The movie isn't telling us that David Bowie is actually playing at the ball, but if they played the medieval equivalent with lutes and what have you, then it would just alienate us as viewers. What the film is telling us is that these characters are listening to a funky, fast-paced, feel-good song, and so it plays a song we will recognize to convey that emotion to the audience. Oh, and more importantly, it's just cool as hell and makes the movie 1,000 times more fun than if they just played some generic orchestral score like it's a Jane Austen adaptation. Which, by the way, is not any less historically accurate than Queen because the instruments in an orchestra also didn't exist in the 14th century when this is set. If you want perfect historical accuracy, then none of the cast would have any teeth and they'd all be speaking entirely in Latin and medieval English. But they speak modern English so that we can, understand it. The modern music is exactly the same, just like the modern clothes are. We want these characters to look good and be relatable, which is not easy when you're wearing something like this. Of course, if this was a more serious drama, then sure, greater levels of authenticity might be more important to help ground the story. But this is a fun, contemporary romantic comedy, and so right from the start it plays We Will Rock You to tell you not to expect a deeply researched, perfectly accurate portrait of life in medieval England. But that's not to say it's completely devoid of research. As we saw earlier, the entire premise of the film came from a historical fact that only nobles could compete in jousting tournaments, while characters like Geoffrey Chaucer and the Black Prince of Wales are real historical figures. And there's actually a period of Geoffrey Chaucer's life that's largely unaccounted for by historians, and so Helgeland decided that this would be a good explanation for him showing up here, and going on to write The Knight's Tale, which is the first story in the Canterbury Tales, one of the most famous works of English literature and a book that has zero similarity to this movie except for these two dickheads.
I will eviscerate you in fiction.
God, I love Chaucer. Imagine saying that to someone. And although it's legend, not history, one of the stories of King Arthur is the inspiration behind the defining moment of Will and Jocelyn's relationship.
If you would prove your love,
Right.
you should do your worst. Instead of winning to honor me with your high reputation, I want you to act against your normal character and do badly.
Do badly.
Lose.
This was lifted directly from one of the tales of Lancelot and Guinevere, which is why we get a line to that effect from Chaucer, but this scene also shows why Jocelyn's character works so well as a love interest for William. Like Will, Jocelyn is also someone who is unsatisfied with the social rules that tell them who they have to be. Her telling Will to lose is a way that she can take control, and instead of having people pledge their self-interest to her, she is for once able to ask that her needs be put first. Oh, and it also lets her say one of the sassiest lines in the movie.
Do not me and spare him. Now be gone. Go!
This scene is another one that was all filmed in a single take. Over 3 minutes of very careful blocking and framing that means that even without the sound, we can still follow what is happening between these characters. When the scene comes to its climax, we suddenly pull in on these close-ups, a stark contrast to the wide shot and placing a heavy emphasis on this exchange.
I will not lose.
Anyway, as you can probably tell from how long this video is getting, I could truly talk about this movie all day. So rather than going on and on, let me just finish by listing some of the other things I love about this movie that I haven't already mentioned. What treating Sir Ector like the dead parrot from Monty Python?
He's not dead! Wake up!
This being the best sports training montage of any movie, partly because of this line.
I think he's getting worse. He is getting worse.
Chaucer's entire introduction.
What are you doing?
Charging.
The look Chaucer gives Watt while he's being threatened. The fact that Shannon Sosaman improvised this line.
That is lovely.
Will choosing to trust and bail out Chaucer, being his first act of nobility and the first step he takes to becoming a true knight. This guy. The silence of the crowd followed by this. Fun fact, that scene was real. The Czech extras didn't speak any English, and so they didn't know that they were supposed to cheer after the speech. Mark Addy actually did this to spur them on, and they decided it was funnier than what they had originally written, and so they filmed it properly. The way that Will manipulates Kate into helping by playing on her insecurities.
Did they say I couldn't do it because I'm a woman?
No, they said you were great with horseshoes, but shite with armor. The fact that you're a woman wasn't even mentioned.
And then later, Kate manipulates Will into testing the armor by playing on his insecurities.
Do you at least have the courage to test it?
Chaucer's entire speech. The fact that Watt is still sleeping with the pillow that they got with the prize in the first scene. Jocelyn teasing the living hell out of Adamar.
I myself, Jocelyn, have never been unhorsed.
Nor have I.
The way that they got this shot by swinging a camera guy off a crane. Chaucer closing Roland's mouth when he first sees Christiana. Roland planning to dress Will up in the fabric of their tent, and the rest of the gang just slowly realizing what's happening. Watt punching Chaucer. Kate watching them dance. This exchange.
You're not gonna wear your hair like that, are you?
Is there another way?
Jocelyn's historically accurate hair extensions. The entire dance scene to golden years. The way that Will says,
I didn't feel a thing.
this line.
It's called a lance. Hello?
The moment when the letter writing ends like this.
William.
You mean Ulrich?
And Will has to confront the reality that he's living a lie and is still not a true knight. Will's reaction to being kissed.
Yes! Yes! Hell yes! Gee, that means she, yeah!
The team betting against the French.
Alright, I'm about this phony close, mate. I swear to God, was in my arm. Listen.
This line.
What are you doing? Losing. I don't understand. Oh, neither do I.
Kate catching the lance. The size of Heath Ledger's eye roll. This little nod between Sir Ector and Will's father. The fact that the boatman in the flashback is the same as the one in the present, emphasizing why it's so important to Will that he change his stars. The parade too, the boys are back in town. The heartfelt and beautiful reunion between Will and his father, and how the film isn't afraid to show us the genuine love between these characters with utter sincerity. When all of Will's friends tell him to run, but he chooses to stand his ground, and Roland says this.
Well, boys, all good things must come to an end. Let's end them together.
The look on Will's face when he realizes what's happening here. Chaucer stalling the flag with his final speech. Will yelling his name in slow motion. The dream sequence where Adamar hovers in midair, completely alone, looking up at Will and his friends. The fact that Will, who is just stabbed in the shoulder, is now apparently healed enough to do this 2 minutes later. Chaucer's final line.
All human activity lies within the artist's scope. Maybe not yours.
The movie ending by panning from Will and Jocelyn up to the stars and then blasting AC/DC. And of course the end credit scene that no one knows about where the gang have a farting competition. Seriously. There's a moment towards the end of the movie where Chaucer says this.
Days like these are far too rare to cheapen with heavy-handed words.
I kind of feel the same way about A Knight's Tale. These days, movies like this are far too rare to cheapen with heavy-handed words or overly detailed analysis. But I hope that this video has helped explain why I and so many other people love this movie so much, and why it will forever hold a special place in my heart.